All right. Hello and welcome to the OLAB Twitch Teach Out Keynote Roundtable. I am Avenel Wing and I am here with Noor, Hammad, and Erik Harpstead. They are two of the researchers here in the lab, and we're going to talk a little bit about why Twitch, what the lab is doing, and specifically what Noor and Erik are excited about. Noor, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
For sure. Thanks, Abby. So yeah, my name is Noor. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute and the OLAB. So my work with Twitch is, most of it involves trying to evolve the Twitch experience from more than just a video and chat experience, and how we can make it more participatory on the viewer side.
Okay, excellent. Erik?
Yeah, so my name is Erik Harpstead. I'm a systems scientist in the Human Computer Interaction Institute, and so in the OLAB. And my focus on Twitch has mainly been around how can we facilitate doing research on Twitch, how can we better understand how people use it, and potentially looking at some of its sort of future benefits and ways that people haven't thought to use it yet. And so some of that also relates to expanding the kind of viewer experience and relating to how viewers and streamers interact with each other.
Cool. So a curiosity that comes up for me immediately is why Twitch? Why this platform? What about it is interesting enough to spur two scientists to go and research? So Noor, I'm going to start with you.
Because it's cool. So there's a few reasons. So as someone who's interested in, just research and just being a nerd about how things work, I think Twitch's development, especially over the pandemic, when everyone is Zoom fatigued, everyone is tired of, seemingly tired of these kinds of experiences, Twitch experienced a massive growth in popularity, not just in terms of viewership, but also the types of content that's offered on the platform. And that to me is one of the interests, is like there's something here is working. There's something very compelling about this type of entertainment. And so that's one reason. As a technical researcher, I'm really interested in how we can evolve this experience and how technical solutions or interface changes or novel game designs influence the community and viewer streamer engagement, and how we can facilitate that potential change. I'm also really interested in, this is not yet in my research agenda, but more kind of a personal goal, is how we can use something like this to more than just esports or, really popular game streaming, but how, global or immigrant communities or cultural, more niche topics can develop and form a community and allow people to learn more about their history. There's something I'll probably talk about more later called intangible cultural heritage, of how we can, how people, the kind of the lost traditions of each of our cultures. And in these online settings, we're actually finding these experiences and histories coming back to life. And I think that's something that Twitch can really do, because it's kind of a long form type of entertainment. People don't go on Twitch for 10 seconds or 20 minutes. People are on this thing for hours and hours to learn or to be entertained or whatever. And I think I just gave you about 5 answers, but I think there's a lot that's really compelling here. And as someone who's interested in how things work and how to make things better, there's a lot to play around with.
You started with this type of entertainment, and we're watching this on Twitch, or on YouTube later. So we assume that our audience has a baseline understanding of what Twitch is. But can you actually, when you say this type of entertainment, what are the things that demarcate Twitch from other types of entertainment in your mind?
Great question. So broadly speaking, what I meant when not just Twitch, but this type of entertainment, things like YouTube or Instagram Live or whatever. One thing that I really like about these platforms is essentially everyone can become a creator. And that's something that's really cool to me. So specifically with Twitch, what it really adds is that two-way communication between viewers and streamers. And I think that's something that, YouTube can have as well in a comment section, but it's not real time. And I think that having the viewers, even not just viewers, they're community members, right? These streamers aren't just streaming content. They want to form online communities and followings. And I think Twitch's form of interaction, which we will probably talk about later, are trying to evolve and expand. But still, the baseline idea of having viewers take part in the creation of something or participation in something, be it entertainment or art creation or whatever. I think that's really powerful and cool in this realm. Yeah, there's something else about to say, but I forgot. So I'll end it there.
Okay, cool. Erik, why Twitch?
Yeah, so for me, Twitch is kind of this really interesting kind of hybrid of a media form. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really interesting. Like I remember hearing when Twitch like first was becoming a thing that people did, and I was kind of one of those like, why would you watch someone play a game for for hours? But then you kind of realize it's like, well, like it's broadcast, but it's not really broadcast because there is this back communication. It's kind of this weird one to many, but also many back to one sort of format, which is unique in kind of media experiences, and it's gotten more unique and more interesting, and people have been using it in very creative ways since. And then another piece of me, so I study also like educational games and how people think and learn and process just games in general. And Twitch provides this really interesting way of seeing how people play. And like you're like literally over their shoulder watching them play. You have their face, you have whatever they're doing, and you can actually have a lot of affordances into play on a long time scale. Like you could do like a quick lab study or something where it's like, hey, play this game, we'll watch you, you'll talk about it, and it's very weird and it feels different. Whereas Twitch has some of its own kind of ecological nuances because it's kind of a performative medium, but there are also lots of cases of going and checking out just like a normal person playing a normal game for hours, and you get this kind of insight into what that experience is like, which is different from kind of the more exceptional types of experiences that we tend to look at when we do research. Where you get a very kind of narrow window that you've set up and structured and made special. And so Twitch kind of has this cool capacity to see that kind of as well.
Cool. So you mentioned the concept of one to many and many back to one, which is, I think, where I've heard a lot of the conversation about like how we're looking at this and how we're studying it. Can you talk a little bit about how the uniqueness of this platform has shaped your thinking about online communication and maybe what you imagine improving or changing in the future for users?
Sure. So some of what we've been looking at, and this kind of grew out of our work in the OLab towards some of the stuff that Noor and I are looking at, is bringing the audience into the experience. So rather than just having a guy playing a game and that's it, you have like how can we kind of give audiences a role or a piece of what they're doing? Mm-hmm. So we start with participation games. You can think things like Twitch Plays Pokemon was kind of like the first big one that everybody was aware of, where like it's just a game being played by the audience. There wasn't the player, or the player was like a robot, basically. And so there are these really cool affordances of chat was a thing, and we can use this textual chat. And it's like, well, can we do other stuff too? And so we kind of have this history of building games where there's either additional UI laid over the stream or different kinds of interactions, things like pulling one person from the chat or the audience into being a special role for a period of time. And these have become more common across Twitch. Like I've seen different kinds of extensions and things that people do where you can like play like some kind of RPG on the margins of the screen while an actual person is playing the rest of the game. And from that, we've started to explore this idea of how could the stream be even more aware of what's going on in the game. So, like a lot of the original APG stuff, and some of the more popular APGs that are out there right now, APG audience participation game, is kind of like it's like parallel play. So, like the streamer's doing whatever the streamer's doing. and then there's a game embedded in the web page, and they're not necessarily very connected. Maybe they interact through like the Twitch bits or things like that, but other than that, they don't really connect. And so some of what we've been doing more recently is trying to develop these ideas around what we're calling game-aware streaming. So can we actually have that metagame connect to the game itself, and what kinds of affordances and interactions can come out of that? And so that's some of what we've been building towards now, is that like we have an audience, you have a game, and how do those intrinsically connect rather than kind of be parallel to each other?
Right. And are there examples out there, or is this just completely now evolving and new ground that you're treading?
So there's examples in the space. My Zoom or my focus doesn't like that. But so one of the big ones we point to a lot is Helpstone. I think it might actually be called something else, but that's what the academic paper was called, which is this tool for allowing audiences to see metadata from Hearthstone. And the way that worked is essentially they would have access to the deck from when a match started, and there's an interface where it's like, oh, we can see what's in the deck, and it was aware of what cards had been played, and you could see like what's coming up, what cards are there. But there are some nuances to how that thing worked, where all it really had was deck and hand information and not necessarily table information. And so if you're familiar with Hearthstone, there's certain cards and things where you'll play down a card and then it evolves or changes when it's in play. And Helpstone, at least at the time, it might be different now, but at the time it couldn't handle that. Like it knew the starting conditions and some amount of change in the game, but it didn't actually know what was going on in the game. And so to try and get to that is a little different. You also see some examples around things like, and this is much more in the esports space, typically, where there is like some fire hose of metadata information around like League of Legends or Dota or something like that, and it's plastered all over the screen. Sometimes not so interactive, sometimes it's while like a shoutcaster or something is doing their commentary, they'll have extra stuff. But those are the main places we see it today. And again, they're aware of the stream, but they're not necessarily interactive back. And so that's kind of, can we do audience participation games while being aware of the game and actually connect both ideas? And there aren't very many cases of that I'm aware of.
Right. It seems like it would be a tremendous, just thinking about how many platforms I've seen people stream from. It seems like that's a very complicated thing to figure out and to navigate. Noor, you had mentioned some things that were not game related that you're excited by. Can you talk a little bit about some of those?
Yeah. Also, just to add briefly, I think
Sure.
there were some examples of games. I think there was Path of Exile that played around with Twitch extensions to actually like affect the gameplay in some way. And I don't know if I'm making this up, but I think Baldur's Gate 3 has something where the audience can choose like the dialogue choices that a streamer plays. But still, Erik's point still stands that these are still kind of, they're not intrinsically tied in terms of it's still a streamer playing a game and viewers being an audience, and not really, intrinsically tied in terms of playing the game together, or at least influencing the game kind of symbiotically. So in terms of stuff that aren't games, I think the more niche communities on Twitch, which are no longer niche, they used to be, is even content like this. The fact that we're chatting about games, we're chatting about all these things. I think that's really where a bunch of cool stuff lies. And part of that is people are able to learn or do something that they might not have been able to before. And I guess it's true also for games. Like you can watch people play a game that you don't want to buy or something like that, or watch professional esport players, do their thing. That's super cool too. But I think there's something really interesting about learning niche skills or creative skills in this medium. What I really particularly appreciate about these kinds of experiences, this is still true for games, but the intimacy between the audience and the streamer. These kinds of communities tend to be a little bit smaller. You're not really seeing, thousands of viewers. Some of them only have tens of viewers or less, and there's just kind of this that one to many becomes a lot more, to me, feels like it's a lot stronger, where you're actually able to influence what they're doing. I mean, what I was thinking of when Erik was talking, and I was just writing about Twitch being a one to many experience yesterday, and one thing I was thinking of was like, sometimes Twitch feels like the audience is like, hey, you're poking the streamer with the stick, like, hey, do something, do a thing, and we're watching, and it's like, oh, it's like you're just. But with these kind of creative streams, I think there's really cool opportunities for, perhaps a viewer is someone who's an expert in this type of art, and the streamer's trying to learn that type of art, and there's this, hey, how about you try this technique or this, and you just watch this evolution happening in real time that I think is just really, really powerful. And I think that's where a lot of the fun lies in these more informal learning communities.
Right. It's interesting because I have spent some time bumping around in Twitch Reddit, which, if you're looking to start as a streamer, is absolutely invaluable. It's such a lovely, warm, supportive, encouraging community, right? I have some, as a woman in gaming, I have some Reddit baggage related to Gamergate. And so dipping my toes in and being like, oh my gosh, they're helpful and enthusiastic. And one of the things that's really a focus over there is, how do I build my audience? How do I get more viewers? How do I get more viewers? And there's kind of a split between people who are like, no, I have my crew who show up when I stream, and the people who want the mega audiences. And it's interesting because some of the other conversations that are happening as part of the Teach Out are about managing those larger audiences and what happens when you have 1,000 people chatting at you at once. And so I am really curious to kind of dig into because we're going to talk about later today, we're talking about AI tools for managing streams and doing community curation and moderation, both before you even start the stream. But for the smaller, more intimate streams, what types of tools are you imagining? How are you, other than the game interaction things, are there things that you have in mind, or that you've got this big vision that it could do this class of things that it doesn't already do?
Oh, that's such a good question. So the first thing that came to mind with this is, I don't know. And I mean that in like a good way. Because I think my current goal as a researcher is just to understand what people are doing in that space right now. So that's kind of the main answer. But some of the things I'd imagine there, it still holds true that I'd like to examine ways where the audience can participate in more than just text chat. I still think that's extremely powerful beyond the audience participation game, medium that we were talking about. Especially if you think about it, like, I mean, the way we'll probably dig into this later, but our audience participation game kind of tech stack, in the way that we want to develop it, involves kind of looping in the audience participation like into the game's code. But in these smaller creative streams, what if it's not a digital artifact? Like, how can you incorporate audience participation in a way that's novel and interesting and meaningful when you don't have that? Also, one thing that I wanted to, just because it's on my mind right now, in terms of minimizing kind of split attention effects for the streamer. As you know, we're doing right now, I have to be honest, I'm actually not looking at the chat on Twitch. That's just something that I haven't been trained to do. And I can imagine if someone's doing really kind of, intricate art on Twitch, learning to manage the chat is probably incredibly difficult. What does that look? How can we change the involvement of that? And also, how can we make it into kind of a two-way street as far as the creation of the artifact itself, if we're talking about art specifically? Because in a way, the community has ownership over the thing that's being created, if they're kind of involved in it. So what does that look like? These are all very rough ideas, but I think there's just a lot of cool stuff to do there. The other thing I really want to stress is how excellent of an opportunity this is to improve or support, kind of multicultural aspects of entertainment. because, as someone who's an immigrant, I really think that being in touch with your culture or helping people do that is really powerful. And I think streams or live streaming platforms in general are a really interesting opportunity to do that. So in terms of how to support that in the interface in research, my thinking is more along the lines of how you can extend it beyond Twitch. Like, how can you make it so that the lessons learned kind of exist outside of the stream? And whether that exists in a different platform, I know that there's a lot of research showing that communities around streamers move on Discord or Reddit kind of exist outside of the stream if it's not live. And perhaps that is where some of the research needs to develop. But I think that's still a rough idea, but I think there's a lot of meaning to be found there.
That's really fascinating to me. I hadn't thought about the parallels yet, but I've run live action role playing communities, LARP communities for years, and you always end up with your game community. And then for years, we had play by email, play by post, play by forum that was a huge component. And so all of a sudden, I just had like this fractal moment where I've been staring at the microscopic and looking at the streams. And I suddenly, while you were talking, had this moment of like, oh, there's all these other like layers of community and community management that I think most Twitch users, if they are regular users, interact with, but maybe don't think about the magnitude and the importance of that and how they become interconnected artifacts.
100%. Yeah, I think that's something that's quite unique about Twitch, because it feels like if you really want to be a community member, more than just someone engaging in the stream when it goes live, then you do need to have these other platforms. And that doesn't feel like it's the case with YouTube. That doesn't feel like it's the case for other things. And I think part of that is the fact that the liveness component of it. I think that's, I wouldn't say a disadvantage. I think it's an interesting opportunity to understand how people, choose to engage with this platform.
What's for people that are watching in the after show, one of the things that Twitch is that defines Twitch is that the videos only stay up for 14 days and then they're gone. It's very ephemeral. And so if you want a deeper connection, you have to have some other platform, or you have to show up regularly for streams. Erik, is it so I drilled down into Noor's like more intimate communities. Is there we have a back channel going on as happens. And Erik mentioned that he'd thought of some additional games that have that APG component. Do you want to talk about that a little further? Oh, muted.
There we go.
Okay.
I thought I had a different mapped to mute. Right after I just answered the like what other APGs are out there, I totally forgotten there is kind of this class around like a game like Choice Chamber, which I think Noor kind of mentioned, that like there is kind of this dynamic of like poke the streamer and like do something, and that's a lot of what some of those APGs are like, where they're hooked up to the chat and it's like, let's add a new challenge to the player and then like laugh at their misfortune for the most part. Or like give them a buff or something like that. Like there are some mechanics like that and people building integrations like that. I think there's a couple companies even that explore that space. And so some of the ideas around like, could we explore, are there other things other than just like straight up sadism or or making the game easier? Other creative ways to use that space. And so can we build systems that could allow us to explore things more openly? And so a lot of my own research is around like building tools for people to do stuff. That's why I was part of the leading the team building the research toolkit. I'm also curious about like, can we build tools to help people explore the space? It's like, I have some ideas about how we could use this, like a game of word concepts I'd love to build, but like, I'm much more interested in seeing what other people do with it if you build them the tool, and can you build these things for people to go and explore and discover what else is out there. Like, you don't just have to use what I think is cool. You could go find what else do you think is cool, and how can we support that? So that's a big part of my research usually is around kind of that level of sort of empowerment around this. And then, and you also kind of mentioned the ephemerality of Twitch, which is, I think, also really interesting. I'm part of my one of my other fascinations is essentially like capturing and appreciating ephemerality, and figuring out ways to either like carry it forward or do creative stuff with it. I think I mentioned yesterday, a lot of my prior research is on using replays. And so replays I find are really creative ways of like capturing an ephemeral thing and turning it into a new artifact, but then you can start to do new different things with the replay. Like you can think about like remixing or things like that, are an interesting kind of medium to play with. And so Twitch is essentially a medium of ephemerality. And so it's kind of fun to see, are there ways we can leverage that and then do cool things with it?
Well, and it's interesting because there's some similarities between, so we talk in my household regularly about the fact that it used to be when a new episode of something that you've been watching came on, everybody piled into the living room, commercials would come on, there'd be a mad dash to go get your popcorn from the kitchen or a bathroom break, grab your drink, and then there'd be the cry, it's coming back, and everybody would stampede back in. We have pause buttons, media lasts longer now, right? We're able to go onto the internet. When something comes off of streaming, there's a hue and a cry. And so this is almost, in some ways, it is almost retro in the fact that it happens and then 2 weeks in the current window of media longevity is really tiny. And so I wonder if there's some part of that is part of the appeal, right? Where it comes and it goes and there's not this sense that you're creating something permanent. Except possibly the community.
Yeah, so I wanted to interject here. So something that's, sorry if that's okay.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm thinking about in this ephemerality that could be problematic or needs more study is how does this affect informal learning communities? If I'm someone that wants to learn a particular kind of music production, how do I enter this zeitgeist of a streamer who's doing the thing that I want to learn? But I joined the stream, Erik and I are interested in drop-in spectatorship, but not just drop-in community engagement or anything like that. Like what if you're on day 7 of you creating this piece of music that I want to learn? And I missed all of your previous stuff. Like how does that behavior change? And I think there is, I guess it was people who grew up in the era of, it's back on, people sprinting back in to watch the show after the commercial break. There is a bit of nostalgia and, there's something to that. But when it comes to learning, I think that's something that needs more study because how do people are using this platform for learning and how does that ephemerality play into it? So.
Erik, you had a thought?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of echo some of that around, like you mentioned, like, what happens if they're on day 14 of this music production? What if they're on day 15? Because the videos only stick around for 14 days, so day 1 is now gone. There's kind of that piece to it as well, which is just kind of reflecting as like as an instructor also, like that is essentially what lecturing used to be, but now we record most of our lectures and put them up somewhere. And then it's kind of getting to the point, well, if we're doing that, then why do I need to keep lecturing every time? If I recorded it once, wasn't the recording good enough? And there's still a value to that, which is kind of interesting to think about. And there are some interesting pieces around, like I've seen people doing things like what they call like improvisational courses through Twitch and different streaming platforms, where they're usually reacting to the audience they had at the moment. So it's like, what do you guys want to learn about right now? And then they'll do something. And it kind of like guides the curriculum development in sort of weird ways. And maybe there's some supports or something that could be built around, like, are you covering what's actually worth learning about, not just what people want to learn about? Because there's some interesting also in the learning sciences knowledge around like what people want to learn, or also what people think they learned doesn't necessarily track with what they actually learn or should learn. And so balancing those kinds of tensions between audience and like instructor and taking that as a different metaphor for audience and streamer, and maybe needs are different when you're using different or going for different kind of outcomes.
Interesting. So one of the things that occurred to me is that I was thinking that I hadn't seen a lot of people doing call and response where people can poke the streamer with a stick that wasn't specifically like game stimulus. But one of the things that I've seen replicated that's really fascinating to me is the sort of community gathering, like a PTA thing where you can get the principal to take a pie to the face, or dunk tanks, similar things where people are using that to raise money for extra life, different thing. For Extra Life, where they do have these like communities that show up regularly, and they'll stream some gaming, and then they'll cut to I'll eat my least favorite jelly bean if 10 people go and donate. And it's interesting that these solutions are being kind of homebrewed and generated even though there aren't official mechanisms. Is there So part of the Twitch model that I still struggle to wrap my head around is the monetization, and how much of your thinking and how many of your like potential tools are targeted towards helping people figure out or interact with the monetization model.
So I can maybe jump in on that. I would say, in general, we don't think about it too much, and maybe we should. I guess is kind of a way to answer that. Like I could see some of the things we're building towards would potentially support kind of like thinking about monetization secondhand. So like generally, like in my own research, I would think more about like key outcome metrics would be things like engagement or enjoyment or things like that, which obviously are going to directly correlate to monetization. But and it's also kind of in my own interest in thinking about tools and things around HCI in general is like the big companies are obviously just spending a bunch of time and energy researching and building monetization stuff. And what about all the other ways you can use these platforms and these tools that they're maybe not thinking about? That's kind of one of the benefits you get in being in kind of an academic setting. At least that's my own kind of orientation towards it. I don't know, Noor, if you want to.
Yeah, that was my answer was simply, it's not really part of my thinking. But I guess the one thing about the Twitch monetization model, and just the nature of streaming on Twitch that really kind of is a struggle, is the fact that, Abby, I'm sure you're very familiar with this. It's like you really need to, it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy to build an audience to the point where you can, actually take advantage of the monetization model. And that's the aspect of it that I was thinking of, is like, how can we help you reach that point indirectly? Not so much thinking about like, how can we make you money necessarily, but it is kind of, I don't want to say cutthroat, but it is a very difficult type of content creation to get into, because not only does it require, talent or ability or an actual entertainment factor to it, but it takes like consistency. I think that's something every streamer or someone who's training you to be a streamer will tell you. And that's the aspect I've thought about, is like, how can we develop tools to, increase engagement, as Erik said, or at least support the things that you want to do as a streamer, so that you can build the community that you want on Twitch. And, monetization model kind of comes after that.
So it's interesting because as you were talking, my brain was like, okay, so there's all these little micro steps, and if you're a brand new streamer, you have to like hit certain metrics before features open up to you, and there's almost a gamified component where you need a certain number of audience members, and then you need to stream for a certain number of days or a certain number of hours, and so there is anyone can do this, but then you hit a threshold where you've gone as far as you can unless you engage in the almost gamification of it, where you need to hit certain metrics to get there. And I can imagine someone like hearing us talk and be like, "Oh, I'm not important enough, or I'm not consistent enough, or I'm not a big enough streamer to matter to this conversation." And Noor, I think you hit on that like very, very directly. That's actually completely beside the point. That the work that you're doing is looking at these other communities because there are interesting sociological and community and technological advances happening in these smaller streams. Is that a fair reflection?
Yeah, that's very, very fair, because not everyone is going to be able to do this full time. Not everyone's going to be able to stream the latest games. If not even, you don't even have to stream games, right? So I think that the more, and I think this is the case with a lot of entertainment, that the more niche kind of smaller communities is where the most interesting stuff happens technology wise, especially for games. But I think as you were talking, Abby, one thing I thought about was there are kind of phases of a streamer, right? Or in terms of community building. And this is something we've talked about in the O Lab, of trying to study how a learning community evolves on Twitch. There's someone who's starting to stream, and that has its own challenges. And then there's someone who, maybe figured out the initial skills, but wants to build an audience. And then there's someone who's trying to hit that threshold, that Twitch affiliate status. And then maybe there's like the bigger streamer who has a regular audience, but then, maybe there's scaling issues with that. And I think each of those is very interesting, but they kind of have different challenges and different research nuances that warrant being explored, but they're not necessarily the same. And it doesn't mean that one is more valid than the other, or is worth more than the other. And I think that's something that, my bigger point was that, as you mentioned, Abby, it's okay if you're not the biggest streamer, if you're not really interested in taking advantage of the monetization model, and that's perfectly okay and encouraged and awesome.
So if you were to sum up where you're at now, like what your focus is there something that you are excited to be sharing with streamers? Or are you still in the, like, where does this go? How do we find our footing in building these tools?
Erik, we're kind of in both.
Okay.
I feed it in both areas. I think Erik's discussion of the audience participation games work, that is where most of my time is going. And at the same time, those tools are still being developed, and we're still figuring out the challenges of bringing this to Twitch. And I think more specifically, my work in the past year has been the educational game side of it. So specifically games for educational purposes. Because how do people learn from watching a game that's meant to have learning outcomes that are supposed to translate outside of the game context? So if we have a game that's, teaching kids how to, do algebra, the game was supposed to be built, for you to play it and learn it. But then if you're streaming it, what does that mean for learning? And then where do the breakdowns or, breakthroughs occur? And then how can we leverage that in designing audience participation games for Twitch? Because as it stands, there aren't many educational games being played on Twitch. But my goal is okay, how can we change that? How can we actually, bring this in a way that's, I don't want to say successful, but rather can be really novel and interesting and warrants further research. But at the same time, it's also very early work.
Right.
So feet in both areas right now.
Erik?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think some of our tools were kind of like in the tradition of like sort of systems and technical HCI, human computer interaction research. They were very much demos that worked in the lab and don't work so well when you take them outside the lab. And they would do things like it was everything just to get it working once was essentially the mission. And what that forces you to do engineering wise is make choices that won't work outside the lab. So things like you can turn off a bunch of security settings for your browser just to get a thing to work, but you can never publish that thing publicly. So a lot of what we've been doing recently is how can we take some of these really cool things we've built and explored, but actually do them in the real world. And so there's a bunch of sort of engineering choices and changes we have to do for that. So like we have ideas and designs and structures that we know are interesting and would love to get sort of additional streamers or additional game designers or anything like that involved. But in terms of the actually doing it is going to take a little bit more and isn't quite ready for sort of public consumption yet. But it's definitely one of our major focuses for the summer and going into the fall. To try and stand these things up in a more rigorous and robust way that actually lives on Twitch rather than through some hacked sandbox web page that we put together.
Right.
So that's kind of where I would think about that and where we're going.
One of the realms that Twitch has been pushed into service, because we were talking about the pandemic and how the pandemic has really sort of changed how people interact with it. One of the things I use it for, and I've seen other groups use it for, is replicating the online event model, where if you've got a bunch of content that you're providing in different spaces or over the course of a weekend. So I run gaming conventions in my other life, and we've brought our developer convention over to Twitch, where we provide our professional development panels. And it pops up, and it's very much like moving into a hotel for a weekend, right? We pop up this little city, we provide the content, we have broader reach. It's fascinating because we've connected with an entire Philippine design community. Our first 2020, we had French and Scottish game designers come and participate. We had people from Australia. So it threw open these doors that we just, like, physically bound by being in New Jersey, were not accessible to us. I've seen communities that have run like mini Ren fairs, where people will come on and be like, I blow glass, and it's really hard to do that on Twitch, but I can talk you through like this glass working thing. And it's interesting to me to think about the fact that Twitch maybe doesn't, as a product, as an entity, doesn't think of itself in terms of serving those communities. Those communities are just like a side effect. I've seen Discord shift, and Discord's like, oh, you're trying to use us for event management? Hold on, we'll build stages. Like, we'll figure this out. We'll respond. Are there things that you've seen or that you're thinking about that are reactive to those pop-up uses that maybe Twitch isn't even taking into account? Are there fringe cases of how people are connecting with the existing tools that are shaping how you think about the future of Twitch?
Yeah, I think part of the original impetus for audience participation games was the pop-up of Twitch Plays Pokemon and all of that. So there's, historically, there's a little bit of that. I think in terms of the tool building, I don't know, it's a hard question for me to answer because, like I said, my interest is in those. The fact that you mentioned that you're no longer, there are advantages and disadvantages, of course, of not being able to be in person, but the fact that you were able to get this kind of global game design community, and those doors were able to be, they flew open. I think that's like so incredibly cool to me. And that is what I would, if I had like infinite time, that's what I would want to leverage. Because I think involving those communities that you wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise, or not just community, just people around the world, and having them access this type of content is really cool. And something that I've discussed in the past about Twitch is that it is a mostly like really accessible product, right? You just have to be like over 13 years old, create an account. I believe there are current statistics that you just need like a stable internet connection of around like 10 megabits per second. So nothing like or 50 megabits, nothing super crazy, to just be a viewer. And that lowers the barriers of entry, like for a lot of people around the world. And I think that's what I would like to leverage, along with the super cool like educational game stuff. But personally speaking, I think getting a global community in this remote setting, it is kind of this like interesting trade-off, right? Where like we don't get to meet each other, but look, everyone is around the world is here, and I think that's just super powerful if we're able to use it correctly.
It was absolutely transformative for our community. It changed a lot of how we're holding our conversations about inviting people in. It changed my activism on a lot of levels. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how being a broadcast platform really changes how we're able to reach people. Erik, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's been interesting, like, because in the academic space, we have a bunch of conferences we normally attend, and it's been interesting to watch the various ways they have all chosen to go very cool. Some better than others, and that's also been an interesting case where I think they'll sometimes use Twitch, but usually as kind of like their side broadcast system.
Okay.
And the community really lives in like Discord or something like that, or in some really poorly chosen purpose-built conference platform that wasn't very good. And so it is interesting to see kind of like these platforms that have kind of grown usually out of either gaming communities or other kinds of special interest communities online, where that is the natural like space for that community. And then they're just like, oh, we can just use this tool we already use and co-opt it in this interesting way, and now we can do all this other cool stuff. It's really interesting to see that happen. Whereas if you look more at some like maybe like more traditional media, like some of these academic conferences where they're like, oh, we have to use this platform that we paid for or whatever, and it sucks. Or like this platform is meant to be like a companion app to a physical in-person conference, and like none of the features that support that actually support online community. And so it's interesting to see how where some of these cases have worked really well and some of these cases have really not. I would actually be curious to see if anybody's actually studying those distinctions. I mean, we're all doing it like on a practical level, where it's like, because I think major events for the next couple of years are probably going to still be considering, are we going hybrid, are we going online, are we going whatever. And so there's at least internal study for that. But I would actually be curious to see if anybody's looking at like what was actually better,
Right.
For some definition of better.
Right. So talk to me about the barriers and complications of studying this platform. Like, I know they exist. We've talked about the good things. We've talked about the really cool things that this can do. What are the limitations or the things that you're having to step around or over? Either one of you.
So I can start on some of those. So one that I think we've kind of alluded to a little bit already is kind of like being a platform of broadcast to an audience. If you want to do interesting study of that interaction, you need an audience. So to have an audience, you have to grow. You can't just like suddenly show up and expect to have 30, 40 people. And like the traditional model of how you would do that in academia is, well, you just pay them, but then you're paying them, and that's kind of weird. Like, and so it's not as natural. And so one of the things that part of this channel has been about is trying to grow a semi-regular audience so that if we wanted to do some random thing, we could just do it. And so like the lead time on that has been a major challenge. Another thing we've been running into, we talked a little bit about this before we even started, is a lot of the tools in this space, like the actual tools people use to just do streaming, like OBS or Streamlabs or whatever, are very bleeding edge. They change a lot. And so on like just a technical level, needing to be ready to adapt to how the ecosystem itself changes and dealing with it as an ecosystem. Like Twitch makes changes to their APIs and things, OBS makes changes to its systems, Discord makes changes to its things. So like you're constantly kind of just being ready to adapt. And in academia, that's always kind of an annoying quality in an environment of study, because it's like it'd be great if we could just focus on like the hard research questions and not all the stupid technical ones that keep changing on us. And then I had a third idea, but yeah, I think it's largely scale and constant evolution has been just a couple of our big challenges.
Or did you have thoughts on that or no?
Yeah, I had mostly similar thoughts, but also it always does feel like you're playing catch up on the technical side. And that's a little bit hard, even just on like just developing Twitch extensions or things like that. I mean, part of the the thinking with just like Erik said, that we have tools that exist in the lab and they don't exist outside of it, but also part of it is like those APIs are outdated now. And that sucks. But also there's like the ethics component of it as like a researcher, like getting approval for these kinds of studies is interesting. And I had to, a lot of the educational games that I was thinking of studying are for younger audiences, which is like a very specific but kind of common problem if you think about it. That how do you study, like what does live streaming look like for kids, but like which has an age restriction. So that was a big problem I dealt with as well. Yeah, there's all these challenges. A lot of it, if you think about it at a higher level, it's the fact that Twitch is this, behemoth of a platform that we don't directly own or do anything with. Like it's that we kind of have to just deal with it. Yeah, and I mean that in like not a bad way, but it's just the way, it is. And I say this all with a smile on my face, just because like it's been interesting, I think, to figure out ways around it. And I think, Erik has been very, very directly involved with the technical work over the years. And I think that's why I wanted him to go first, because he's, very aware of the fact that like, things keep constantly changing. And, there's all these kind of elements to think about.
It's funny because while you're talking, I'm like, the how do we get around that? How do we work around that? How do we adapt? Is very much my experience with being a streamer. With OBS just did a thing that is completely inexplicable to me. That's okay. I have a workaround. That is absolutely a text message I sent this morning where I'm like, it just did a thing I can't do. Never mind. I figured out. I'm just gonna fake it. And it sounds like there's some parallels there between the actual user side and the so the audience members are actually the part of the community that are not making it up as they go along.
Yeah, I think that's very like kind of, you hit the nail on the head there, because it's like we're all kind of excited, right? Like we all see the potential of it. But then 90% of what we do is like working around it or like wrestling something to just get it to do something that seems in your head very basic. And it feels like part of it is, trying to improve these technical tools like OBS, like Erik described it is bleeding edge. But also, I mean, maybe this is a discussion we can have. Like, is that just an inherent quality of liveness, that there is this kind of messiness to it that, you just have to deal with? I mean, I also, I've watched hundreds of hours of Twitch at this point, and I know that it's multiple times during the day. It's like, oh, we can't see you. Oh, we can't hear you. Like that's just an inherent quality of doing something live. And it's interesting because it just means it's a little bit messy and kind of, on the ground, and you just have to deal with it in some ways. But hopefully we won't have to. I'm not saying we should things that should stay this way, because it does kind of suck that we have to spend so much effort wrestling, Twitch to do what we want it to do.
I got a lot less whiny about the complications of working on Twitch when I started mentally comparing it to cable access TV. Because if you think about all the things involved in like working video cameras and having the technical expertise and getting things connected and getting things broadcasting properly, like something in me was just like, oh, this is actually fundamentally easier and it's an open source product. So there are people out there that are super nerds that I can just be like, hey, can you just explain to me why it's doing this stupid thing? And why do I have to stand on one foot to get it to work? It shouldn't work that way. And they're like, oh, you're doing this the hard way. Let me show you. So I don't know, you said something that was maybe we should actually have this conversation. So let's dig into it a little bit. Like if you were to imagine this, how you impact the streamer experience, what fingerprints do you want to see 5 years from now on streamer experiences from the work that you're doing now?
Oh, great question. So the first thing that comes to mind, regardless of the actual details or nitty gritty of the kind of work I want to do, I would like streaming to reach a point where people can push a button metaphorically or seriously and just do whatever they want on stream. Like just kind of offload all that effort of all the technical work and just have it work and they can do whatever they want. And I know that an inherent quality of being a streamer right now is that you kind of have to it's like a one-man show of a bunch of stuff. But that is one quality I would like to see. As far as 5 years from now and the kind of work that I want to do, I do want to see audience participation games being kind of a mainstay on Twitch, and not because I think they're going to breach, they're going to be like these amazing things, but rather because it means game design can continue to evolve. And I think something Erik mentioned very early on is part of his interest is giving people tools and seeing what they do with them, and developing like an audience participation game toolkit or design considerations or best practices is part of that. Just because if we were to give game developers this tool and streamers this tool, what kind of cool stuff can they do with it?
Right.
And that's kind of a big interest for me. And it also applies to the educational games side of it, that I do want to see this type of work evolve into more educational experiences beyond just, a lecture on, I guess in a way it's an evolution of what learning looked like during the pandemic, where a lot of lectures were done over Zoom, but maybe, we can evolve that on stream to be something, playful and interesting. Yeah.
Excellent. Erik.
Yeah. So yeah, how would we expect affect the streamer experience in the next 5 years? I would hope that things have kind of solidified a little bit in terms of the tooling and trying to get closer to that kind of push button experience. And hopefully that leads to more people being able to kind of get in and stay in the space. Obviously, that's not the only reason people drop out of the space. That audience growth side is definitely another challenge to it. But I guess along those lines, the thing that I would love to see is kind of sort of a further appreciation and support for mid to small scale streaming. So we could build tools for the giant 1,000-some whatever a day streamers, but they already have tools and they already built them, so they don't really need our help necessarily. And so can we make it easier, more interesting, more approachable for the long tail, which is probably quite a lot of the actual streaming going on Twitch. And what are those experiences like? Are they just trying to be the big people and they're not there yet? Do they want to end up somewhere else? And how can we help that happen? Is I think something I would be really interesting to see in what we can support.
Excellent. So I have a thought brewing, and I have two Twitch experts, and I want to ask this because it is a thing that keeps rattling around in my head when I'm trying to talk to people about Twitch as an art form and Twitch as a cultural event. I do a lot of interaction with the indie RPG design scene, right? That's a good chunk of what my other world does. And there's been an entire conversation about decolonizing RPGs and making them more accessible to more people by reducing runtime, making them smaller and tighter and faster to interact with. And to me, there's a dichotomy where on the RPG side, which is an interactive, creative endeavor that requires community involvement, where getting it streamlined and getting it smaller and bringing women and people who are marginalized who maybe don't have a lot of leisure time or don't prioritize leisure time means making it as easy as possible and as fast as possible. And this may actually be part of the answer to the thing I'm thinking. But then you've got this other side where Twitch, we've talked about the fact that people log on and watch for hours, and streamers are plugged in, and there's kind of an expectation that if you're streaming for less than an hour or less than 2 hours, you are an exceptionally short stream. How, just from the perspective of like how user bases develop and how you're looking at building tools for these user bases, what do you think is the foundation of the specific, like, we're going to log on and play this game for 3 hours and people are going to hang out and watch us? Like, what is happening there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Just to clarify, when you're talking about the RPG in increasing involvement and diversity, do you mean in the creation of those RPGs? Like the
Actually, in people coming to the table and playing.
Okay, yeah. I think so. To answer the latter question of people, there is, like you said, there's kind of this weird thing where like you want to reduce barriers to access, but a lot of the people that we want to target in that, like you said, they might not have a lot of time. And Twitch is still somewhat impenetrable generally, but then people are watching streams for a long time. And how does that exist? I think it's also like a question of like, what is the nature of engagement and watching? I think like, I don't have data on this, but no one on Twitch or most people are not just sitting and staring for 3 hours. A lot of people might be doing something else. And in a way that could coexist with the lives of the people that we're trying to reach with this content or the tools, right? Like how can we, maybe they're, busy in their normal lives and we can help them engage with this live streaming content. So it's not just like, sitting and binging a TV show, right? Like, because if they don't have time for that, then they certainly won't have time for watching a stream for 4 hours. So that's one answer to that question. I'm gonna let this brew for a little bit. I'm gonna ping it to Erik.
Yeah, that's gonna be part of my answer too. That we you could simply think about like you've got a streamer, you've got viewers, but like the viewer experiences can be very different in a lot of different situations, and so like a lot of times people are like kind of peripherally viewing,
Right.
while they're doing something else. You think about like if you want to like use a sport metaphor because so much esports is what's happening on Twitch. Like there's a difference between just having like a game on in the background versus going to the stadium. And those are both two different kinds of spectatorship that actually are facilitated through Twitch. And so it could be something, or you could think about watching a theater production on PBS versus going to the theater, and how the level of direct engagement, the level of your own attention and how you'll treat the stream is very different. And so I don't know if it's just like I think like making things faster, easier to engage initially, but also making it easier to continue engaging on a peripheral level throughout. So not just kind of the attraction, but also the engagement stage. And that could be kind of an interesting thing to look at in terms of maintaining these kinds of new communities or RPGs or something. If you think about what do I need to know? This is actually a thing we've talked about, not at all related to tabletop RPGs, but interesting that it relates. I'm thinking about like what is a drop-in spectator? So someone who jumps in the middle of a stream. In particular, if you're thinking in an RPG, how much context do they need? Like, do they remember who the characters are, what's going on, how this game works, what's the culture you're building this off of? Like, is there a bunch of onboarding they need to understand what's going on? Is there kind of a way that they could get that? Like, maybe there's some kind of game-aware extension or something that could help support that. Of like, here's like a digest of what's going on, or something like that, or and then in continuing to follow the narrative, can they kind of do that peripherally versus like deep engagement? Do they need to basically be a player to know what's happening versus versus having some kind of mid to low level of engagement consistently and still kind of appreciate where things are going? And so, yeah, I think thinking of those gradations of the level of intensity to engagement and how you can build for that, either in supporting things through Twitch or in how the stream is run or how you communicate with your audience.
Well, I hear some parallels between how you like build a podcast. Are you building something that someone can step in and just pick it up in the middle of your stream, or do they need to follow along? And how much buy-in and how much genre literacy, right? You can pick up Welcome to Night Vale at any point, and it's creepy and it's weird and it's cool. And if you have some genre literacy, you can jump in. But if you actually want to know what's going on, you start at the beginning and follow along. And so it's interesting that there may be other realms of media that have done some deeper thinking on how do you build storylines or engagement or community structures to bring people along. Noor, you were having a thought.
I have two thoughts that are somewhat conflicting. On the one hand, I really, it's the life of a researcher. I do agree with what Erik said, that there are kind of levels to engagement, like the being like there's the intensity, but I also argue that there's, as we've mentioned before, that there's like different, like there's a temporal element, right? That like you can engage live, but it's interesting. I think it's interesting to consider like how do the asynchronous platforms affect this? Because suppose I can't engage live, but I can engage with the asynchronous platform of that community at any time. And the sport metaphor also holds up here. Like I'm just getting into like Formula One races, but if it's in Australia, I'm not going to get up to watch the race. But then I have all this news afterwards and the reactions that I can catch up. And how that fits into those communities that we are trying to invite. I think that could be an answer to that question. But again, one thing about Twitch that I've yet to understand, and I really think needs more research, is how do people start? Like when you mentioned genre literacy, I really thought that was something really interesting, because how do people start getting into a niche topic?
Yep.
And also, what does that look? Because those are major barriers of entry at this moment. So, trying to make things faster or quicker, like what does that even look like? If I want to get into, the ancient art of Bedouin weaving or whatever, some of those thoughts, on the drop in spectatorship level, on the community engagement level, like all these levels, it feels like there's just a lot of barriers there that I just don't want to engage as someone who's, thinking about something like this. And I think there's kind of competing, right? Where like, it feels like on the one level where if I was, genre literate, but I don't have time to engage with this content, I can exist in the asynchronous space. But if I want to get into something new, what does that even look like? And I think that's why an aspect of the informal learning communities that's really fascinating to me. Like, can someone who's never done game development just use Twitch, and someone who's live streaming like game jams to learn what this world even looks like, versus someone who has a little bit of experience? Yeah, I think there's a lot in this space that's really interesting.
How much of the barrier is platform-based? Because I'm thinking about the fact that if I go and watch something on TikTok that's somebody that's cooking food that I've never heard of before, all of a sudden TikTok gives me all of these options, right? And so if I wanted to learn how to make glass noodles, TikTok is like, oh, you're into Korean food. Here's so many options. And they're tiny little digestible moments. Whereas Twitch, I don't have the same, it has something that intuits where to point me next in quite the same way. So how much of our barrier for finding or connecting with those communities is actually baked into the platform?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, of course, TikTok and Instagram, the algorithm is very well set up to keep you engaged for long periods of time based on the content that you watched or want to watch. So I think that's, it is an aspect of Twitch that I'm not really, I think that does require improvement, because, even trying to find super niche streams, it's a little bit hard, and you do have to dig into the categories. And like you said, support for, oh, you watch this for a lot of hours, how about this? I think that needs improvement. But also there's stuff that's just inherent to the medium, not just the platform, in the sense that I can watch a 20-second TikTok about glass noodles, but am I going to watch a 3-hour, or am I going to jump into a 3-hour stream that's already an hour in, to figure out how to make these? And that's the answer. Just feels like no. So just on a personal level,
right?
Like why would I do that if I can, do a 20-second TikTok?
Yeah, and I think there are some interesting dynamics to the organization of content on Twitch that they're getting better at. Like, and they have been getting better at even since, like, I started looking at it and paying attention to it as a researcher, where like one thing, like if say I want to learn like a game or even a genre of game, like I know exactly what game is being streamed at every single stream that's streaming a game. But if you think about different kinds of cooking, there's just cooking. It's like a giant whole category. And so like the gradations and kind of the ontology in sort of the IRL tag space on the platform is pretty underdeveloped. Whereas on the game side, it's like I could know like literally what version of whatever specific video game this is, and that's built in there because it started as a game platform, and so that's where a lot of that came from. And so they are getting better at bringing in some of these more IRL tags, but it's still, I think, underdeveloped in terms of understanding like what is this space of this particular like food category or music category, because even the music ones, I was just clicking through the directory, like they're not that developed, and so it's a little harder to appreciate how those might be related, and maybe there's some work that could be done around how these could drive you to one or another, or even maybe like among communities of streamers, of like these people are aware of each other and they work together and stuff. And I don't think there's a whole that is something that's not very easy to tell. Is if there are communities of streamers that collaborate with each other, I see those come through as well. And I think that would be definitely a platform limit there.
As somebody who manages metadata and manages metadata constructed by like disparate groups of humans, I appreciate that on some level. I look at their tags and I'm like, okay, I totally understand why you don't just let people free form throw their tags in there and make it up as they go along. But tagging this conversation has 0 tags on it because at some point I tried like 7 or 8 different things and I was just like, fine, forget it. I'm going to move on. And it's interesting that you can tell that they are still evolving their engagement with things that aren't esports, aren't monetizing heavily, and are just like these side fringe communities that exist in their space.
Yeah. One thing I keep thinking about is like, I feel like we can learn a lot from literature, from like cognitive science, or even how people like, people's television viewing habits over the past like 30 or 40 years, and how sense making occurs when you're just dropped into something. Mm-hmm. Because in a way it is coming back here, because everyone needs to be primed in some way to start making sense of content. And I think Twitch, because of its liveness being just the core of everything related to Twitch, I think that's something that needs more work, because even in the case of stuff outside of cooking, like I was reading an article a few years ago about how esports is, hot take, it's a bit of a bubble. And part of the argument was that unlike non-digital sports, like, real sports, there are metaphors that are kind of, we've been primed our whole lives to make sense of, where like I can watch curling for the first time and kind of figure out what's going on. But if I'm someone who's never ever seen Dota before, I have no clue what's going on in this esports setting. So how do you prime someone for understanding that in a drop-in live setting? I think there's, something that needs to be done about that because I really think that could boost engagement. And the potential of what we're talking about of like Twitch is more than just esports. Twitch can be used for all these sorts of things, because at some point people do need to drop in and join these communities, right? So
right. Okay. We have touched on a bunch of different topics. Is there anything that either of you wants to double back and either revisit or dig a little deeper on?
It's been an interesting discussion so far. I'm happy to keep it going and briefly touch on all these things. So I'm good on my end.
Okay, Erik?
Yeah, I don't think anything comes to mind.
Okay. So this is different, right? Is the thing that I keep coming back to is we're seeing something that hasn't existed before. No, get out. Hold on. I have to bump somebody. Okay, cool. Speaking of running things on multiple platforms, we are actually on Discord and just had someone pop in. Man, okay, where was I? I was thinking about how do you pull in those cognitive scientists or that other thinking, right? Because I keep thinking about the fact that streamers don't get any initial onboarding on how to manage parasocial relationships, right? This is all like learning it by screwing it up, learning it by having somebody with inappropriate boundaries show up in your Discord. How do you do the community management? How do you learn to say, as for me, right? I've been in the analog gaming space for 25 years, and it's in the last decade that I've been able to turn to someone and say, we don't do that here. This is a evolving art form that's pulling in a lot of people who don't have that sort of community background or that sort of support. So what can you imagine as far as tools that might help onboard people to the building healthy communities and actually creating communities with shared values or shared standards?
Oh, yeah, that's, a really difficult question for me to answer because it is just so important because it drives people away more than just, oh, the barriers of entries are too high. No, this is like on a human level just messed up. And I think that's something we didn't mention when we talk about the challenges of Twitch is a lot of the toxicity that unfortunately plagues the platform like crazy. But also, part of it is the fact that you mentioned that the Reddit is just so welcoming and great. I'm wondering, do we need to create tools for that, or can we like leverage these existing knowledge bases and just empower people to share that knowledge just the way they are, right? Like I think maybe this is an opportunity for me as a researcher just to be like, okay, like we don't need to create a brand new tool here, but how can we just leverage these existing knowledge bases for people?
Right.
And some tools that I was thinking about, mostly just toxicity management, kind of like AI-based tools to manage content like that. But yeah, I'm kind of stumped here just because, not because it's like a difficult challenge. I mean, everything we're talking about are difficult challenges, but more just because this just strikes on a human level that is ideally would just not be a problem, but that's not how it works.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because it occurs to me that one of the things that could conceivably be part of it, right? So we're using a Discord that I have set up where in order to get into it, you have to acknowledge the code of conduct. And it's possible that some part of this is like you pop up into a chat and before you interact, you have to click a button that says, I've read the code of conduct and I agree not to be a jerk, and checking for bots. And we agree not to participate in hate raids, right? And so it occurs to me that there's some similarities that are happening in community management spaces. Erik, thoughts?
I think one of the challenges around like having tools like that would be great, but I think also one of the challenges that can happen with a platform like Twitch, and extent happens on things like Twitter as well, and platforms like that is their capacity to go from 0 to 1,000 really, really quickly. Like the fact that they allow that, which one, like you do want to have things like that. Like if you are a big popular streamer or whatever, like you want to afford audiences of that structure and engagement of that scale. But the fact that like, say like for thinking about rating or something, how quickly it can go from like fine to terrible with a ton of people and like the structure of a broadcast platform like that affords that like both to be positive but also to be really negative. And are there maybe things we can think about or ways we can think about building tools to like have like an e-break or or a structure around this looks like maybe negative growth or something, to understand how like where do you feel your stream is getting out of control, right. and is that like you it's kind of hard to stop people from just loading up the page and viewing it. You can probably close the chat down, stuff like that. But what kind of affordances exist to maybe slow things when you want them to be slower, and as a way of kind of managing?
So that almost puts the public nature of Twitch on like the list of challenges to be factored into the development of tools that coexist.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just thinking about how do we help people manage and create spaces that do the thing they want them to do is a thing that I'm constantly thinking about, and picking your brains about that is very cool for me. So thank you for indulging me.
Yeah, I also think an aspect of it is kind of outside of toxicity. One thing that you mentioned at the start of this question, Abby, is like the streamer needs to learn this. The streamer needs to do this. We talked briefly about the barriers of entry for viewers trying to learn something, but I'm also interested about the archetype of, or not archetype, but potential streamers of non-game content, where this type of stuff is just extremely too high for them. I mean, just on a personal level, if I'm looking for like a Middle Eastern like cooking thing, like recipe, I go on YouTube, and the one that I pretty much always follow is like this random old lady who's like older than my grandma, and she's carrying a phone and like it's shaky, and she's just showing you, and it's great because like I got the content that I need. How can we like support that kind of streamer that isn't going to have the fanciest camera, or like, because I'm sure like the Twitch Reddit gives advice like, this is the kind of mic you need, this is the kind of lighting you need, this and this. What about the more like
they're actually shockingly like, start with what you have, which is one of the things that blew me away. Was very much like, here's your baseline. Here's the you need a camera, you need some decent lighting, you need a camera that doesn't hiss and pop, and then you're good to go. So I have some skepticism where Reddit is concerned, because I tend to assume that they're going to take the position of, you need the high-end lights, and you need the high-end camera, and you need the aerial rig and an extra camera and this, and that just wasn't my experience, and that was pleasantly surprising.
Yeah, I think that's a pleasant surprise to me as well, just from what you said. Although on second thought, it does kind of make sense, because the struggle with starting a stream is that you just need to do it, right? Like, just start it and then learn as you go. So like, what is like nitty gritty streaming look like?
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if the pandemic and the fact that people adjusted to Zoom, and the fact that people are working without the best lights and without the best cameras and without the best microphones sort of shifted people's expectations. Because when I send out panelist instructions, I say, whatever equipment you use for Zoom will be sufficient for this. It's ephemeral. It's not, right? Yes, we're copying it over to YouTube, but if you really, really hate it, it just disappears and doesn't make the transfer, right? And so I wonder if the pandemic benefited the art form on some level.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I started thinking of like, are we kind of in a way developing standards, like implicit standards of what's the minimum requirements of this type of engagement? I mean, even in Twitch, like there is kind of like this ubiquitous interface style of like, you have camera view or like content view, and then like the camera view in the corner. Like, I guess we are developing these more implicit standards of what a stream should look like, and the pandemic, of course, meant that all of us, have to have a decent camera and decent headphones. Some of us have backups and all that. So, that's an interesting point that, it feels like we're a lot more suited to remote engagement now than ever before.
Yeah. I have run out of things that I am excited to pick your brain about today. So I think if you are both content, I think we can wrap up and just put a pin in this to say this is going to be an ongoing conversation. This art form and this research is going to continue. I can't imagine that Twitch is going away. And even if Twitch went away tomorrow, I think the thinking is foundational to how people engage with online communities.
Yeah.
Do either of you have anything else you want to add?
Live streaming is cool. It's kind of my
final
point.
Excellent. All right, Erik and Noor, I really appreciate that you gave me an hour and a half out of your day to talk about this. I think that it's interesting and exciting work, and I think that everything we can do to make it more satisfying and exciting for people to be engaged is powerful.
Thank you so much for having us, Abby, and looking forward to doing this again at some point.